Hi, welcome to another edition of Political Science Fun Time with me, Professor Selby. Today we're going to be talking about the evolution of the American party system from the origin of the United States to today. It's a long lecture. Buckle up. It's a good time. We're going to cover a lot of interesting stuff. Maybe in the future I'll split it into two. I don't know, but it's kind of like a quick tour of American history. So remember, a couple of things to really keep in mind. One, we have a two-party system. It's because of how the government was set up. It's our system of rules is what matters. That is single-member plurality plus presidentialism equals two parties, no exceptions. This also has cascading consequences on other things, such as one, our political parties are large coalitions. That means they're different material interests and actors who need to then work together and make compromises in order to win political power. And two, those diverse interests and actors will shift party allegiance in a process we call realignment, because sometimes they get annoyed at their party, the other party gives them a better deal, something like that. So this lecture is going to follow those coalitions and those shifting realignments that have defined the American party system through time, okay? I really want you to stay focused on one, the coalitions that make up the parties, two, the realignments that define the changes in the party eras, and three, the key issues that people are fighting about, and then also somewhat for the stupid choices, or in some cases, smart or principled choices that parties make that sometimes cause voters to come or leave, okay? And those both happen. You make a choice and people leave, or you make a choice and people come. But winning isn't everything, right? Like some of the choices that are made are actually principled choices. So let's look at this. This is the Republican Party platform from 1956. And you might be asking yourself, wow, this doesn't really look a heck of a lot like what Republicans today would support. The answer is they don't support any of this, and for good reason. Realignment, especially since 1956, has led Republicans to go in a much different direction, and now it's Democrats who pretty much support all of these issues, okay? Truth be told, keep in mind my partisanship lecture from earlier. The two parties used to be much more intertwined, overlapping, and now they're really far apart, okay? So the Democratic Party platform in 1956 wasn't much different from this, actually, because at that time, they actually agreed on a lot of stuff, okay? They just don't agree on it anymore. And that's what we call realignment. Here we go. So, coming out of the writing of the Constitution, that's what we call the first era of American political parties, you had this first distinction between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, okay? Federalists were the people who had supported the American Constitution. Anti-Federalists were people who didn't like it. And this was our first sort of party system. One important thing to keep in mind here is that the parties were not yet institutionalized. What we mean by institutionalized is with an independent existing structure like a business or something like that, above and beyond the people who at that time agreed with that party, okay? So the Democratic and Republican Party today, they have fundraising mechanisms, get out the vote people, it's like a business or a nonprofit. They have all these people are invested in keeping the party going independent of the particular candidates. But here, early American democracy, parties weren't really developed yet themselves. Really, they were just kind of legislative coalitions, okay? So the Federalists had kind of their thing. The Anti-Federalists had their thing. There were voters that kind of agreed with each person, but there was no larger unifying structure there, okay? So just keep that in mind. That doesn't really come for another 30 years, really. The Federalists had supported the American Constitution, which actually don't put here, but put that in your notes. The Federalists had supported the American Constitution. They were also more open to using government power to stimulate the economy. So they weren't like socialists or something who you might think, oh, they're trying to like regulate or destroy or something. They actually thought like, look, government should be sort of like helping business was kind of like their logic. And they also they wanted closer connections with Britain, and they were strongly aligned with Northern industrial manufacturing interests. The Anti-Federalists, they were more isolationist as far as international affairs goes. They're more focused on agrarian policies, okay? But this created a difference in, economic policy between the two parties. Now, the big mistake here was, and Federalists really, this was a huge mistake on their part. The War of 1812, Britain invades the United States, trying to sort of like reabsorb the United States back into the British Empire. 1812, the British Empire is still massive. If they had really put their mind to it, they could have come in and crushed us, but they didn't realize how much resistance we would have. They thought we were a little bit weaker than we were. So they didn't put their full effort in. And but the Federalists also, this was their mistake. The Federalists did not put their full effort in. Okay, and the Federalists were a little more in the north, and they just kind of were lackadaisical in the war effort. But it really showed, and in public opinion, it really showed. Okay, so after the War of 1812, like the Federalists were kind of like, people were just like, look, I don't like you guys. Like, you really should have been, you got to support the team, right? Like, this is war. You can't be kind of, going halfway on this one. Just at that same time, the Anti-Federalists sort of rebrand is what was called the Democratic-Republican Party. That might sound weird to you, but that was just what they were called, so it's not a big deal. And they started sort of peeling off some disaffected Federalists as well. Okay, the Democratic-Republican Party picked up a lot of the anti-Federalist economic message, but they were a little bit more moderate. And then when the Federalists really kind of collapsed from power, the two actually very interesting presidents from this era, James Madison, who had helped write the Federalist Papers, he was a former Federalist, and James Monroe, who kind of followed in his footsteps. They really kind of governed from the middle. What does that mean? Well, when making appointments, when passing laws, they tried to get things that, satisfied a large percentage of the people, not just, 51 or 52%. They're going for 60, 65% of people would be happy with this. And that's actually really smart. If you can get a legislative coalition that's going to satisfy more people, maybe it makes sense to reduce your, gains for your partisan players in order to have something that more people sort of appreciate. So, and then at the very end of this period, for about 10 years after the War of 1812, really the Democratic Republican Party was the only game in town. There was a few Federalists who were still there, but it was like, it's like, oh, hey, check out that guy. He's a Federalist. He's like, oh, I'm a Federalist. They're like, ha ha, stupid Federalist, right? Like, there are not that many of them. There's a few. 25, 30%, but if you're getting voted down 70-30, like, it's kind of rough. Okay. Second era. The second era is incredibly important, actually. The second era sets up almost all the rest. So the first era is a little bit quick and easy. Second era is going to take some time, and it's very important. So I want you to take exceptionally good notes here on the second era. The second era runs from basically the end of the period of the founding fathers being president all the way up to the Civil War. It's 50 years, well, 40 years, but that's a pretty long period. The Democratic Republican Party renames itself just as the Democratic Party, okay? So from then until today, it's the same name. A lot of positions have shifted, but it's that same name. The old Federalists plus some disaffected Democratic Republicans form another party called the Whig Party. The Whig Party took its name from Britain, again, because we had a lot of connections to Britain. And the Whig Party in Britain was kind of like the country party and the party of resistance to kingly power. Okay. And the Whigs, through most of this period, kind of played that same resistance role. They really didn't like Andrew Jackson. A lot of people didn't like Andrew Jackson, but he kind of played a larger than life image here. And at the same time, both the Whigs and the Democratic Republican parties are becoming institutionalized, right? So just like I said before, you're having stable platforms, voter outreach, money raising, committees, party leadership that's different from who's running for president or governor or senate that year, right? There's someone who's a party person who's just helping to maintain and control the organizational stability through time. Andrew Jackson is the key president in this period. So I already mentioned him, but like he's incredibly important for a whole ton of reasons. First, he's the first president who's not one of the founding fathers, essentially. Monroe, Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson, Washington, Adams, all of them had been in the Revolutionary War and or at the Constitutional Convention and or around at other things, that kind of linked them, right? But all those guys have basically now died off. And there's a new breed coming. And Andrew Jackson, second point that makes Andrew Jackson important, he was not born into wealth. He's the first president who genuinely speaking was kind of like a commoner, okay? And a lot of the wealthy people in the United States resented him for that, and they attacked him for that. They attacked his wife because she had been divorced and he remarried her. Oh, dude, in 1830, this was like scandalous. I mean, this was extra level scandalous, right? So, like, the tabloids were just going nuts on Andrew Jackson. But to his credit, I mean, he had been a general. He had this big persona. People really responded to him. And he was the first person to really be a sort of popularly, truly speaking, man of the people. I mean, he was also very controversial. For example, well, did I put it in the other one? Well, it's also under Andrew Jackson that you have the Trail of Tears, right? And so, like, that's one of the things. Oh, there it is, Trail of Tears. That's one of the things that, like, incredibly makes him controversial. And I mean, the treatment of Native Americans in general, not just Andrew Jackson, but he's also a particular example of this, was just horrendous. Like, it's not like no one today would allow this kind of treatment on people. So just to be clear, like, that was not cool. What else is happening at this time? Okay, there's a very important phenomenon we call the spoils system that was part of the institutionalization of American parties at this point, right? Institutionalization meaning the development of American parties into these organizational structures that are stable through time, like a business or a nonprofit. And patronage basically means support me for president and I'll give you a job when I win. Okay? It's trading jobs for political support. If that sounds like corruption to you, it's because it is. Patronage is by definition corruption. This for that. But it was what was happening at the time. And the truth is, we still have some of this at higher levels. Doesn't go as far down. Betsy DeVos, I'm not trying to troll or anything, but she's currently the Secretary of Education. And she donated like a ton of money to Trump's campaign. And then magically she becomes Secretary of Education. And what does she do? She's, running the education department sort of like in her interests or the interests of the people who supported her, et cetera. Now, honestly, appointing department heads is part of the president's job. Like, to some extent, all presidents have some of this at higher levels, some of this patronage style system. But under Andrew Jackson's time, it didn't just end with some of those higher level positions. It went all the way down to your local postal service worker, the city clerk, the surveyor, the tax collector, the teacher. I mean, it doesn't matter. Like, Like that patronage system didn't just stop at the top, it went all the way down. And everyone was doing it. Okay, so, Democrats, Republicans, well, it's Whigs, Democrats, Whigs, everyone's doing it. And this creates a real problem, right? I mean, like your postman, it'd be nice if he could read. Well, if he got his job because he supported the guy who ended up winning the election, that may or may not mean he's actually good at his job. It may mean he just got his job because his buddy got elected, right? And then he can't read, so he can't get the mail to your mailbox, and that's really annoying. So patronage, see, right? That's one of the problems with patronage. So there you go. At this time as well, there's the various types of issues that are starting to divide the American public are becoming much more serious. Federalists, anti-Federalists had economic distinctions. That was fine. They had distinctions about how strong the central government should be. That's all fine. But there's more than that now, right? The North is industrial and the South is agrarian. The North is free and the South is slave. The West was neither free nor slave unless states joined the Union. Like I was saying, I had to step away just for a moment, but like I was saying, the North was industrial and the South was agrarian. The North was free, the South was slave. The West was neither free nor slave until states joined the Union. Okay. Now here's the problem. The problem is that each of these three issues consistently lead back on one another, and there's no real easy way out. Okay. So you want to pass a trade law, right? You're the North, and you say, let's pass a trade law. Okay. Well, the problem is the South wants cheap industrial products from Britain. This is called the nullification crisis, okay, which is a famous period in American history. And they get mad at you because it's prejudicial to their agrarian interests because your industrial products are not quite as cheap as those in Britain. So they're pissed, right? And then, but what does that difference really come down to? That difference really comes down to slavery, right? And then, well, maybe we're talking about adding a new state to the Union from the West. Okay, is that state going to be free or slave? And a lot of westward expansion a lot of slave states were part of the westward expansion. I know we don't have that in our popular image, but it's just a fact. It's Missouri, Texas, like these were all slave states. And like that's a real problem, right? And there's even worse, there's a balance of power in the Senate between free and slave states, okay? And it makes it really hard. I want to show you this. It makes it really hard to make it all balance out. So here we go. It's going to go back to the beginning right now. So you're going to see it. Okay, this is early, 1789, just after the Revolution, 8-5. Now it's 9-8. Notice the states are coming west. Okay, this is I think that's I don't know, different Missouri Compromise, right? 12-12, 13-13. Now we have Wilmot Provision, 1846. Right, 1514, 1517, and then 1861, 1519, and then that's the outbreak of the Civil War. Okay, so like just look at this as it goes. Like you can see the states moving west. You see like this balance of power here at the bottom, but this is in the Senate. So this is like how many Senate seats are oh, that's so funny. This is in German over here. Slavienstaden, Freistaden. Slavienstaden means slave state. Freistaden means free slate. Slavstaden means slave territory, free territory. That's funny. I've been using this for a while. I don't know. I found the German version. Okay. But you get the point. Okay. From current slide. Okay. So that's not going so good. Okay. And it really starts to get worse. A lot worse. Okay. So as westward expansion and also trade policy and these kinds of things are really bringing this issue of slavery to the fore. The American public is increasingly becoming polarized over it as well. And if you think that the fights we see now over race are bad, like, look, I'm not happy about them either. I'd much prefer that we could do a better job. But like, we're talking about 150 years ago and a currently existing system of slavery and slave owners who were trying to expand that system, not just in the Western territories, but even into the North, because they recognized that if they couldn't expand, if they couldn't win, they were going to lose. That's what they realized. If they couldn't win, they were going to lose. So their goal was basically to legally force the North into having slavery, because that was the only way they knew they could finally win. And Northerners at first thought, oh yeah, well, we'll just hold the line, whatever. And then they increasingly realized that, like, look, like, there's no middle ground here. We're going to have to just like win this somehow. Okay. But the westward expansion was a big problem here, and it really was recreating these problems over and over and over again. So Kansas, specifically, was almost like a prelude to the American Civil War. Okay, in Kansas, you had pro-slavery forces literally beating up what was called the Free Soilers, people who wanted to have wage labor and no slavery and stuff like that. Now, the Free Soilers were not, by today's standards, particularly unprejudiced. They didn't really like people of color either. They just didn't want slavery. Okay. So not that the Free Soilers were some kind of like perfect being or something. But you literally had fights in the streets, like way worse than anything we've seen here today in America between these different factions. You had one senator, a pro-slavery senator, literally use his cane and beat an abolitionist like severely on the floor of the Senate. Like, just imagine that. In the halls of government, one guy comes in and is just wailing on another guy. And he had like permanent damage and stuff. I mean, very, very serious types of behavior here. And it's quite clear that, when these things are happening, an underlying social issue is coming up to the fore. Okay. Bleeding Kansas, as it's sometimes called, and I put it here. Bleeding Kansas, as it's sometimes called. What? I'm going the wrong way. There we go. That's it. This is what I was looking for. Bleeding or Bloody Kansas, or Bleeding Kansas is what they call it. Congress kept trying to cut different deals to find a compromise. I just skipped a slide. I'm not going back. This is my third time. To find a workable compromise on slavery, but the two sides were too far apart, and they would cut one compromise, it would fall apart. They would cut another compromise, fall apart. Okay. I already mentioned that second bullet point. South wanted slavery everywhere. They realized the only way for them to really be stable was to sort of push their agenda to the end. The North increasingly wanted abolition everywhere. There's not a good middle ground there. And then in the West, especially Kansas, an idea called territorial sovereignty was developed, which just meant that the states would pick if they wanted to be free or slave. Predictably, things did not go very well, and you have these huge fights in Kansas, which even lead to a free soiler and a slave government being set up in different cities, and each claiming legitimacy over the state of Kansas, right? Like, this is like, things are not going well, guys. We're in trouble. And literally they're fighting in the street. So I just skipped that last slide. I'm back here. Okay. John Brown. So from these fights in Bleeding or Bloody Kansas, from these fights, radical abolitionism begins to develop in the United States. Okay. John Brown himself used some violence. He wasn't as violent as most of the popular imagery of him is, which is quite interesting. He wasn't exactly nonviolent, but he also wasn't, just like kill them all and let God sort it out. Like James Martell, who is a Thais Martel, I don't know. There was a French guy who was like, just kill them all and let God sort them out. You're like, oh, that's not a very good attitude. Anyways, John Brown was in Kansas, and he saw these fights in bleeding Kansas, and he was radicalized, and he went from being kind of moderate abolitionist to being a radical abolitionist who thought, you know what, at least some violence is justified in advocating for freedom of enslaved persons. And I have to say, I don't believe he's entirely wrong about that, right? Like, um, slavery was clearly a massive injustice of humanity, of, like massive proportions. And it was also enforced by using violence, right? State violence, police, they return slaves, they help people who own slaves to keep them. There's a whole system of regulations. And so if violence is being used to maintain a system, violence is relatively obviously justified in overthrowing an unjust system. That's not that crazy of an argument. At the same time, that's also treasonous. Totally, absolutely treasonous. Even if your country is wrong, using violence to overthrow it is treason. Keep that in mind. And John Brown, but he was radicalized by what he saw in bleeding Kansas. And one of the first things he saw was a bunch of pro-slavery forces haul out some free soilers and just beat them to a pulp in the streets as a kind of like public message. If you're a free soiler, this is what's going to happen to you. And when he saw that, he said, that's not okay, and I'm going to do something about it. So he and his sons went and he dragged out the pro-slavery kind of gang. They were just thugs, right? I mean, these guys were like thugs for hire, basically. I mean, this is Wild West, really, at this point. And he dragged them out of their houses, and they got out these swords. They had guns, but they brought out their swords, and they said, repent or die. And, the guy said, well, we repent. We're really sorry. Please let us go. Anytime someone says repent or die, you just go ahead and repent, right? It doesn't matter really what the moral here is. But John Brown, I think, was fundamentally right. I mean, I'm not going to, treason's not the best thing, but, fighting against extreme injustice is pretty important. Who's this? This is John Brown. So I love giving this lecture, one reason, because there's a couple cool pieces of art that I can talk about. I wish there was more art I could talk about. Well, there is, but I can only get so much sidetracked with art. But does he look a little bit crazy in this painting? Yeah, probably. This is in Kansas. I think it's a bank or something, but it's very prominently. It's like this huge mural style painting. What do we see here? How does he look? So he's got those crazy eyes, right? That big beard. He's got a gun. And what's that? That's the Bible. He looks like Moses. This has very strong Christian themes in it of Moses leading his people out of slavery into a new land for them to be redeemed. It's actually very powerful, right? And then you have the Union and you have the Confederacy, and John Brown is here, and what's happening with his foot? Stomping on the head of the Confederacy. The allegory is a little heavy-handed. I would definitely say that. But I mean, this is actually, and then you have the clouds, right? These like storm clouds, and I mean, this is basically like a Civil War kind of like allegory. Very, very interesting moment. John Brown later he tried to lead a slave revolt on Harper's Ferry, which was a munitions depot. A munitions depot is just where you keep guns like that. And so he tried to lead a raid on Harper's Ferry to get guns to go free slaves, to not really start, not to kill people as much, but more just to try to round up as many people as he can and get them out of the country. So Underground Railroad style thing, but a little bit more open about it. And he had done some similar kind of raids on slave plantations earlier, and you just kind of beat down the doors. You try not to kill anybody, free the slaves, get them to Canada, and that was kind of his goal. Well, what do we see here? This is move that down, The Last Moments of John Brown. This is another famous painting. This is John Brown here, looking a little more realistic, kissing a little African American child with the mother there, right? Like, so the moral here again is kind of like a kiss is love, right? It's kind of like this interracial kind of like moment. What do you see here with this guy? He's looking away, and the bayonet ready to come down on John Brown's neck. John Brown was tried and convicted of treason and summarily executed, which I'm not sure was entirely wrong. As much as I'll sort of like defend John Brown in other ways, like I think treason is still treason, and I don't know what to tell you about that. The red kind of like these little blood like little images, but he here is portrayed much more almost like Jesus, very kind, very nice, that loving embrace. There's a kind of like tragedy and sadness to this painting. I actually much prefer this painting to the other one. The other one, I find that people I've known who like that other painting, they're a little bit too radical for me. They're ready to spill some blood for the cause that they believe in. But this one's a little bit more like the non-violent side, which he was okay with some violence, but he wasn't like hardcore violent, and really wanted to minimize violence. And I think that's what you see here is more John Brown kind of as more of a human, not this mosaic extra sort of larger than life character. But if he is more sort of like the Son of God here, more human, like literally, like that's what the New Testament is all about. It's really more like being human. So I just think that's an interesting one, a nice moment in American art history, right? So cool paintings about cool guys. I don't really care what side you're on. I would talk about art history all day if I had the choice. So that was a fun digression into art history to help us summarize the end of the second party era of party. I like art, but what's happening here? Okay, right? Let's think back. Second era, Democrats dominant, a little bit more in the South, but these three issues of slavery, economics, westward expansion are all literally overlapped on each other. And as we get to the 1850s and then things that's happening with John Brown and Bloody Kansas, the singular issue that's rising to the fore in American politics is slavery. And literally, like, churches are splitting apart about it. Other types of interest groups are splitting apart about it. You have an election in 1860. Lincoln and the Republican Party, and they'd kind of been coming for a while, they win in a three-way race between a Republican, a Whig, and a Democrat. Okay, so Lincoln wins, he gets the presidency, and immediately the South secedes. I mean, whatever, it's like 6 months or something, but like it's very little time. And the South was right that Lincoln was prejudicial to their interests. He wasn't a radical abolitionist the way John Brown was. He was a pragmatist. But he certainly wasn't going to let the South just kind of like secede. Okay. And here there's a dumb mistake that was actually made by the Whig Party, which was they didn't even take a side in the whole slavery question. But it's like, imagine there's a three-way race today and no one takes a side on, immigration. You're like, but like immigration is one of the key, or like Black Lives Matter or something. You're like, these are like really key issues. And you're like, well, I don't know. I see both sides. I mean, Biden, he's not hardcore one way or the other, but he's like, look, here's a plan. I have a plan. I want to do this, right? I'm a little bit more here than there, right? And Trump's like, I'm totally here. Well, what if you had a third party that was like, we don't know what we think? Well, who's voting for that party? Nobody, right? Like, you got to at least come up with a plan, gentlemen. So anyways, the Whigs got selected out. That was their dumb mistake. Too bad for the Whigs. We didn't want them anyway. They're just a stupid British party. I'm kidding. Henry Clay is a great American orator. So I might tease him. We don't want him anyway, but like the Whig Party is just as American as anybody else. Okay. So there you go. Lincoln gets elected, South secedes, Whigs disappear, Civil War breaks out. Coming out of the Civil War, we enter the Third Era. And so from here, things are getting much more contemporary, right? Democrats and Republicans are going to be stable from 1860 to today. So we've got a lot of history left to cover, but they're going to be stable. Coming out of the Civil War, the Republican Party is, entirely dominant for this entire 40 years. And even through to the next party era pretty significantly. Because they're the party that won. They got strongholds in the North and the West, and the Democratic Party really just becomes the party of the South. Okay. And they already were pretty strongly aligned with the South, including under Andrew Jackson time. But in this era, like the Democratic Party is infiltrated with KKK. I'm not going to lie to you about these things. They're not super pretty. Okay. The Republican coalition at this point is so the Democratic coalition is the South. That's just who they are, right? In the North, and the Republican coalition is abolitionists, industrialists, and also I didn't put this here, but it's worth mentioning, Western farmers and small business people. Okay, so it's like there's this very strong, big coalition that has a lot of interests in common. Like farmers in the West are selling their crops on commercial markets, so that links them strongly with the industrialists. There's something of a tension between the industrialists and the small business guys, as well between the industrialists and the abolitionists. But it's, they're like, well, like, what's the other option? It's not what we want. It's the South. Like, we're not interested. So the political sort of pressure that kept the Northern industrialists and the social reformers together in the second party era was really important. Basically what had happened was the thing that brought the Republican Party together, and again, this happens very late. It's like the 10 years right before the Civil War, the Republican Party comes together, is the industrialists and the abolitionists had a similar common enemy, and that was slavery. The abolitionists were motivated more by ideas and morality. The industrialists they agreed with a lot of those ideas and morality. They weren't just crass materialists, but they had also the additional incentive of thinking like, well, coerced labor is a threat to how I do business, right? What if these Southern people start, making factories and putting forced labor into factories, and that could be a real threat to my way of life. So they had the money. The industrialists actually self-funded the armies that fought the Civil War. Like, it was not funded by the government itself. It was actually it was funded the way you would fund a political campaign. You would call people, or at the time you'd show up to their house and say, like, we're fighting this important war. Can you give me $1 million? And they'd be like, oh yeah, like, we got to do this. Here's $1 million. Okay. So the industrialists, really put their money behind the Civil War, to their credit. And some of that was self-interested, but some of that was, I don't want to just say it was all self-interest. They genuinely also believed in the cause most of the time. Some of them were probably, crass materialists or whatever. After the Civil War, the Republican coalition's even a little bit stronger because all the freed slaves start voting Republican, right? It's like pretty clear, like, hey, these guys like did something really awesome for us. Let's support them, right? And this coalition was quite strong so long as they had a common enemy. But what happens? What happens is, the common enemy goes away. I should have just said that, but I'm into the lecture. I can't stop now. The common enemy goes away. You don't have that slave-owning faction that's such a strong threat. You made big gains in the Civil War, so the abolitionists start losing some of their motivation. The industrialists are like, well, like it's not quite like, the sharecropping and other types of systems in the South weren't perfect. They were actually highly problematic. But to the Northern industrialist mind, it's like, well, we also made a big gain here. I'm not quite as worried about it, right? So what's going to happen is you're going to start to see this sort of crack or fissure form between the abolitionist / social reformer side of the Republican Party and more the big industrialist side of the Republican Party. The Republican Party had also adopted at this point, which is similar to what we saw at the beginning of the lecture, the Republican Party at this point had also adopted a lot of the Federalist-Whig economic positions of trying to use the government to stimulate the economy. Okay, I know you're not used to thinking of it this way, but it's called mercantilism. Andrew Hamilton was really into it. China today is doing a lot of this. And, the idea is government should be sort of like spurring business, like, trying to help them out, not just by letting them do whatever they want, but by like trying to like be creative, right? And this was stable with the Republican Party up to about 1970. And that part of that also, they were also willing to regulate like highly unsafe workplace conditions, right? So this is part of the social reformer side of the Republican Party, which was, like, let's not lose fingers at work, like that kind of thing. So what was the Republican Party supporting at this point that kind of harkened back to the Whig and Federalist economic positions? Things like national banks that can lend money to businesses that can then be more innovative, right? And lend money in ways that are, a little bit more adventurous, if you will. A little bit, because capitalists are only going to lend money when it's like a guaranteed win, right? But like the government can give small business loans, stuff like that. Railroads or other types of roads, tariffs to support industry. So tariffs we've seen these come back with Trump. This actually kind of harkens back to the old Republican way of thinking. Not a huge fan of tariffs. They're not as bad as some people say. So it's a little bit more nuanced story, I think, than most people would try to admit. Support education, right? Like higher education, super big drivers of economic growth, right? People get college degrees, bigger degrees, they start businesses, they're smarter, they're innovative. It really drives growth. Okay, and these are Republican economic platforms they picked up from the Whigs and before that the Federalists, such as Hamilton. Hamilton wrote a report on manufacturers that's like on this dimension. Okay, so right after the Civil War, there's a period we call Reconstruction, where the North literally left their army, camped in the South. They enforced voting rights for African Americans. They, protected them from violence from non-state actors like the KKK and things like that. Okay. But that's a really hard project to continue. And, like some people on the left are like, oh, if only the North could have had more willpower and kept it going. But it's like, I don't know how long you can really expect someone to keep this going, Not that I object necessarily to having had, more racial equality sooner. I don't. I think that would have been a good idea. But how much are you willing? How much money? How many lives are you willing to spend doing this? And the North, they give it about 10, 12 years, and they just lose willpower. Okay. And I mean, they tried hard. I mean, if you're in a marriage for 10, 12 years and it really wasn't working out and you bailed, it'd be like, I don't know, you tried pretty hard. I mean, so the North tried hard. Maybe they could have tried harder. I don't know, leave that to other people to fight over. But while the North was there and enforcing Reconstruction, voting rights for African Americans were enforced. And like literally you had to protect African Americans like with the army. Okay, like that was the only way African Americans were voting. It wasn't like, oh, they should be there and be nice. No, it was like you literally had to have army soldiers like escort African Americans to the polls in order to vote. And by 1877, basically radical Republicans just started giving up on the attempt to reconstruct the South. Too much resistance from the South, too much money, too much time, too much difficulty. They just like couldn't see themselves continuing in this project. They reincorporate the South basically on equal terms, and pretty much instantaneously, the South begins to use new means to exclude African Americans and non-whites from the political process. So this was called Jim Crow. Jim Crow was, different from slavery, but still really bad. Things like poll taxes, grandfather clauses, segregation, separate but equal doctrine, literacy tests, and open violence upon African Americans were incredibly common from about 1870 to 1960 in the South, which actually interestingly peaked right around 1930. So I don't know why that happened, but like at first it was like maybe not as bad, I don't know, but like right around 1930 was this real peak in violence, and it already started to go down even before civil rights and stuff like that, although happily we made it end quicker. So like I said, they tried pretty hard, but it would have been nice if they had been more successful. They just kind of ran out of willpower. And the industrialists start to gain the upper hand in the Republican Party. In this post-Civil War period, we call it the Gilded Age, okay? You have monopolies, robber barons, terrible workplace regulations. I mean, really, like, capitalism at this point is not nice capitalism, it's mean capitalism. And people have some legitimate complaints with how these industrialists are basically running their workplaces and then also, to a large extent, the country. And abolitionists, these kind of social reformers, they start looking for new projects. I mean, they made a big victory. Maybe they could have gotten further, but they're kind of like, okay, knocked that one out. What else can we do now? And they start looking at issues of labor rights, or what was called working men's rights at the time, unions, which intersected with that, workplace regulations, women's rights, immigrants' rights. Those do-gooders. They're always looking for a project, right? So they just kind of start going in all these different directions. And even before the Civil War, in fact, many abolitionists were some of the early feminists. So 1848, what there was the basically beginning of American feminism, and there was a conference held at Seneca Falls, New York. Frederick Douglass was actually there, so was a lot of early American feminists, and that was kind of like the beginning of American feminism. But when those do-gooders start looking at factory conditions, they're no longer turning their eye to a common enemy. They're now turning their eye against their, quote unquote, friend, who's always a little bit of an unstable alliance to begin with, right? And so that's where these fault lines begin to open up. That Republican coalition of basically Western farmers, small industry, like small tradespeople, but then really the two other big components being industrialists and social reformers, the former abolitionists, those four main constituencies. That's still stable through the Fourth Era, but it starts to sort of crack even more, okay? So very similar conditions to the Third Era, but actually the social reformers start to get the upper hand in this era. So, in the Third Era, the industrialists were the ones who were really kind of winning more of the time. But here the social reformers start to, like, people are just kind of like, look, this is ridiculous. If you've read Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, about sausage factories and what happens in sausage factories, like fingers and rats end up in the sausage you're eating, like, you would rightfully be a little bit upset and say, like, maybe we should do something about this. Seriously. And that's true. That's all totally true. The story I just told is completely true. I mean, it was 120 years ago, so there you go. The social reformers start to get a little bit of an upper hand, right? Very similar coalitions as the Third Era, but the social reformers are coming out on top. And then the key issue here is really the power of industry. It was kind of coming in the Third Era, but the social reformers, they're kind of maybe like starting to organize themselves and figure out what to do. And then they start to coalesce around sort of like new ideas. And those new ideas that they come up with are called progressivism, which today is a thing of Democrats, right? So, like, if you hear Elizabeth Warren, she's like, I'm a progressive. She's hearkening back to these progressive Republicans of the 19 teens and 20s and pre-FDR New Deal style stuff. And what did these progressive Republicans start to do? Well, they supported basic workplace regulations like maximum work days. You can't work someone more than 12 hours a day. That might seem obvious to you. It wasn't at the time. Health regulations, things like that. They also supported systems of direct democracy, such as in California. You have the initiative system. This is really big. This type of progressivism was very popular in the West. So California, Oregon, Washington, and some other Western states use the initiative system far, far more than other states in the nation. In fact, many of them don't even have direct democracy whatsoever. We'll talk about this later. We got a whole unit on California politics coming, but that's a big deal. The progressive reformers also started to end the spoils system. So they started to realize that, like, look, winning an election shouldn't mean that you can reappoint everybody all the way down the line. There's obviously a fair amount of reappointment you should be able to do. I mean, putting somebody, going through the normal process and putting somebody into heads of departments is perfectly fine. But reappointing surveyors, reappointing postmen, reappointing city clerks, and stuff like that seems a little bit over the top. One of the main mechanisms they use to end that type of patronage system were civil service tests. So if you wanted to be a postman, if you wanted to be a surveyor, if you wanted to be a clerk, you had to take a test that actually proved that you could do the job. That might sound very reasonable to you. It is. But that only happened about 110 years ago. Not that long ago. I mean, like you might have a grandpa who's like pushing 100. So he was born just a little bit after this era. Okay. Other things like primary elections, you might think, oh, of course, like Democrats should get together and vote for who they want their nominee to be. Well, that didn't happen before. Pre-progressive era, Republicans, Democrats, Whigs, doesn't matter what political party you were, the way you picked a presidential candidate or any candidate were the key players in the party went into a room, drank whiskey, smoked a cigar, and said, hey, who should we run for president today, Johnny? And Johnny would be like, let's run, Herbert Hoover. I think he's a good one. He'll really support our interests. And then go to Herbert, hey man, you're gonna run for president. How's that sound? He's like, sounds good, let's do it. And then he would run for president, okay? So we would call that system oligarchy, decision of the few, the key players. Where you see super delegates, that still has some of that oligarchical element, who are very important players who get a little bit of an additional voice. But the very notion of regular voters voting for the candidates that were going to run for president didn't even exist until like 1890, right? Just before this period. It was the progressives who modified the party system in order to do that. So that seems like a very normal thing for you, but that was not normal at the time. Great progressive Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt. And he was interesting. I mean, the social reformers and industrialists are hard to keep together, but it can be done. Okay, so it can be done. Teddy Roosevelt did it. He was really good at that. He gave a little bit to each side, kept both sides happy. overall, I kind of like Teddy's persona, but he wasn't any better than Andrew Jackson as far as treatment of Native Americans. So, like Andrew Jackson had the Trail of Tears. Teddy Roosevelt said the only good Indian is dead Indian. Like, that's not okay. Like, we can't say those things, okay? But he said it. Jackson was no better. I don't know what to tell you. And there was really two sides to progressivism, okay? And Teddy Roosevelt was a little bit more the second side. But there was first rule by experts, and we would call that the more technocratic element. You see that with civil service tests, with ending the spoils system, right? That's the kind of like technocratic or rule by expert side of progressivism. And there's also a more populist or like rule by the people side. And you see that with direct democracy, primary election for political parties, and those kinds of things. So progressivism wasn't one thing, kind of had different tendencies within it. The great American philosopher John Dewey was more of a technocratic progressive. I actually think he's way overrated, but who cares? That's neither here nor there. It was Hiram Johnson in California that passed the direct democracy system. Okay, I know it's taken a while, but that's just lecture. It's like a full hour and 20 minutes. That's just how it is. Okay, then what happens? Herbert Hoover gets elected. It's not really his election that matters. It's the fact that the Great Depression happens immediately after he's elected. And when the Great Depression hit, the problem was he just didn't really know what to do. Okay, so Hoover kind of gets a bad rap. I don't really want to cast aspersions on him. He wasn't as bad as people say he was. It's not like he was some genius either. But you should move with trepidation when you're talking about presidents. I mean, like most of them are relatively smart guys, and I'm not sure about Grover Cleveland. I have some, there's some exceptions here, but who cares? And the additional problem here is he really didn't know what to do about the Great Depression. Nobody did. But the steps he did take were almost certainly counterproductive. They almost certainly led the country into more economic trouble rather than less. And even if it would be unreasonable to expect him to particularly know better, he was at the head of the ship when the ship crashed. He tried to fix it. It sank faster. Like, some responsibility still falls on him. And then really the sort of moral here as well is the social reformers were begging for more government intervention, and he didn't want to do it. Okay. And he really kind of sided with the big industrialists. Well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that the social reformers are ready to go and join up with the Democrats. Okay. So this is a huge, massive shift that happens right in 1932 with the election of FDR. Okay. And the social reformers see that Herbert Hoover was not on their side. He clearly aligned with the industrialists. The industrialists were just trying to protect their inherited wealth. They didn't want to try anything new to help the country. And if you think the Great Recession was bad, I mean, a lot of my new students are like, oh, Great Recession, I don't know, how bad was it? It was bad. Okay. And same thing here. Okay. Same exact thing. This is it was terrible, and he didn't do enough. Okay. And what that meant was that when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was running for president, he could make an appeal to those social reformers and say, look, all those progressive economic ideas, I'm going to do them now. Come join me and the Democrats. The time to switch is now. You were Coke, now it's time to be Pepsi. Pepsi's going to take care of you. Pepsi's going to do what you want. Let's do Pepsi, right? And the long history of the fifth era is basically FDR to LBJ, not LeBron James, Lyndon Baines Johnson. I know I love LBJ, LeBron James. I actually also like LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. I think he's a very interesting guy. I'm not really into the whole president worship thing, but he's just one that to me. I like Nixon too, actually, right? But LBJ kind of is a very interesting character to me. In this time period of the fifth era, the Democrats are dominant, so you see a lot more Democratic presidents get elected. Not exclusively, of course, Republicans get elected as well. And at this time, the South is still Democratic, okay? So you have this Southern kind of Democrat that we call a Dixiecrat. And a Dixiecrat are Southern white Democrats who were willing to support FDR's and later Democrats' economic message so long as it was whites only, okay? And I really mean that. There's no doubt about that. And Dixiecrats were like a total, like, FDR would complain about them because he would try to pass like a labor reform law, and then the Dixiecrats would carve out agricultural workers. And they'd say, well, it's going to apply to everybody, but not agricultural workers. Why? Because agricultural workers were dominantly African American in the South. They would carve out service workers. Why? Because in the South, service workers were dominantly African American, right? And so even to today, the legacy of these Dixiecrats is still there. So a lot of our labor laws, the last big reform was actually in the New Deal. And we carved out these categories because of our racial prejudice. And it's like, dude, that was almost 100 years ago. And I'm not sure that was the best idea. So anyways, but that's a Dixiecrat. Dixiecrats are Southern Democrats. They were a major part of the Democratic Party from Andrew Jackson to Lyndon Baines Johnson. And that's 150 years roughly of time that they were one of the main players in the Democratic Party, okay? Now, it's quite clear that if you have, now look, in 1932, the Dixiecrats and the social reformers are able to work together because who's the common enemy? The Great Depression, right? It's easy to put the racial stuff a little bit to the side because you're like, the sky is falling. Like, everyone's in trouble. You know what I mean? So the social reformers, and they actually would push, the social reformers would push at the Dixiecrats would push back. I mean, it was not a stable alliance even from the very beginning, but it was stable enough. And FDR was able to get us to the Great Depression, World War II, you come out of it. And that was basically the Democratic alliance all the way up until Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1965, okay? And it's like at that mid-late 60s to the early 70s when this coalition just completely crumbles, okay? I mean, look, the Democratic coalition might have been able to hold if those darn social reformers hadn't looked at the greatest injustice of their time and wanted to do something about it. But hey, if you see massive, crazy injustice and you don't want to do something about it, like, I don't know what to tell you, right? The South still had Jim Crow. It was the era of segregation, violence, like direct violence upon African Americans. Like the level of badness here is hard for your modern brain to understand, okay? And like even conservatives today who are like, oh, BLM's going too fast or, whatever, like they don't want to go back to what was happening in 1955, 1960, because it would mean they would have to behave so terribly towards other people. And they really don't want to do that. So just keep that in mind. The social reformers and LBJ with them, who actually had been a Democrat. LBJ was from Texas. There's a really good movie called LBJ, The Early Years, that's highly worth seeing, and it covers him from his rise to basically being vice president, like just before the assassination of Kennedy. So it's like this really interesting like slice of his life. But LBJ basically was like, look, JFK, John Kennedy, got killed. We're doing civil rights now. And he pushed through the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act on the memory of JFK. And he was a master parliamentarian tactician. He had been in the Senate for a really long time. And he begged, borrowed, pushed, stole. It didn't matter. He put all his cards on the table in order to get the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act passed. And those two pieces of legislation were, those were the successes of civil rights, like just amazingly important, okay? And yeah, it's a little bit ironic that a former Dixiecrat, and he had even been a KKK member, but here's the deal, like you want to run for office in the South in 1950. I don't know what to tell you. You're going to have to make alliances with some unsavory people. When push came to shove, he made his choice, and that's not the choice that he made. That was a choice he made to get himself going. But once he had an opportunity to make a different choice, he made a different choice. And that's a really interesting sort of lesson in how people change. I mean, anyway, so just keep that in mind. But, you better believe that the Dixiecrats didn't like this very much, right? So Dixiecrats look at LBJ and they're like, dude, like, you're our guy. What'd you just do to us? He was like, yeah, I know. Like, I don't know what to tell you. This is more important than just maintaining a political coalition. And, Democrats made their choice. LBJ and Democrats collectively made their choice. And basically, as a result, the South started to shift to the Republican Party. Okay. And the sixth era of party system. So we're almost there, guys. It's almost exactly an hour and 15. I can do it in class just like this. So I know it's a little bit long, but that's just how it goes. The sixth era basically runs from 1968 to today. Some people today suggest that we're entering into a seventh era, which is an open question. I'll discuss it at the very end, okay? But remember, realignment. Voters are shifting back and forth, right? But the main shift in the sixth era is the South from being solidly Democrat to being solidly Republican, okay? In this era, the Republican Party is dominant. Yes, Democrats also get elected to, the presidency and other offices, but Republicans are having a little more power. Nixon, I mean, to his credit, like I said, I'm not a big fan of like all of the things Nixon did. Watergate was obviously a huge mistake. But Nixon was a very clever and smart politician, and even if I don't agree with him, I kind of appreciate like his thought processes sometimes. Although he was also terrible. I mean, everyone was racist back in the day. So like on the Nixon tapes, you just have Nixon just like saying these awful, terrible things about people who are anyone who's not white, even like Catholics and things. I mean, it's like the level of prejudice historically in the United States is so far from what you guys are experiencing today. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do more, but also it's like, keep it like take it from a little bit of an older dude. Like, wow, some of the things I've seen, I really hope you don't see them. If you did, you should stop it, like I tried. Okay. But Nixon saw the opportunity to appeal to the South. It was called the Southern Strategy, and he did, and it worked. Okay. And that was this major realignment that defined the sixth era, right? So the South, which had been solidly Democratic for 150 years, as I hope you now know, it's like Democrats are lucky if they get North Carolina. Florida is sort of a swing state, and maybe Georgia. Okay, but like there's not a lot of Democratic victories in the South. But if you look 50 years ago, the South was entirely Democratic. Okay, like all those states were voting Democrats, landslide, no problem. Okay. So Nixon saw the opportunity. He appealed to the South. Reagan really solidified that coalition. Okay. And Reagan came, from California. And actually, early on, he had a little bit more of that older Republican style way of thinking. He actually extended some labor rights in California and things like that. But then he really became more of a big business sort of free marketeer and, cracked down on unions, support big business, and made an alliance with like the sort of culturally conservative faction in the South. Okay. The Falwell types and that kind of thing. And Reagan really solidified. Nixon started it, and Reagan solidified that alliance between industrialists and religious actors that largely defines the Republican Party today. The other thing in the sixth era that we see is it's what we call the culture wars, where we're just mad at each other about pretty much everything. We're fighting about race. We're fighting about gender. We're fighting about economics, right? Um, you know, Trump is really good at fighting the culture wars. So whether you like him or you don't like him, I think that's a pretty fair statement. He's good at picking these sort of things and like using them to his advantage. So just keep that in mind. And then the current coalition. So like, what are like after coming through this whole long lecture, it's been over an hour. You probably want to watch it a couple times. Like in class, I'm like, bam, 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 bam. Thought about breaking it up, but I just kind of had to get it out there. Um, what are the current coalitions? What are the different groups that are making up the Democratic and the Republican Party? Well, so Democrats have this sort of progressive era populism, which kind of feeds into sort of New Dealism. A lot of non-white ethnic groups. So first, that's like African American. So African Americans strongly realign after 1965, and they become like very reliable Democrats. So in 1890, 90% of African Americans voted Republican. Today, 90% of African Americans vote Democratic, and for good reason. They recognize that that party supports their interests more, right? And environmentalists. Okay, I'm going to sort of add on to this in a second, but the Republican Party in the sort of sixth era was a little bit more progressive era technocrats, former Dixiecrats that kind of morph into the kind of Christian coalition type of mindset, and anti-taxers, and big business. So that big business industrialist has been around for the whole time. And then the question is, are these coalitions tenable? Are they going to be stable? And the answer is maybe. We'll see, right? Think about what I said right at the beginning of this lecture. I said, look, some people think we're entering into a seventh era. There's some evidence for that. I said, also, I'm not entirely sure that's happening. And so just tell you a funny story. When I was a college student in the late 90s, one of my political science professors walked in and said, oh, the Republican Party is going to fall apart. These cultural conservatives and big business people can't get along. And like what happens like 20 years later? They're doing just fine. Okay. So, take it with a grain of salt. But on this next one, we'll see. Because could there be a seventh era? Well, like I said, the evidence is mixed. Okay. Realignment does continue. So what are the shifts we're seeing now? Interestingly, non-college educated white voters who were before the sort of old progressive populists are shifting to the Republican Party. Okay, so they've been Republicans in the 1890s, they've been Democrats in the 1940s, and they started becoming Republicans again in like the 1990s and 2000s. Very strong shift over the last 20 years, non-college educated whites to the Republican Party. Meanwhile, college educated voters, white and non-white, are strongly shifting Democratic. Okay, they had been a very reliable part of the Republican coalition. I hadn't talked about them as much because like cutting up coalitions, like I don't know, there's a whole bunch of different people. Everybody kind of matters. But college educated people had been a reliable part of the Republican coalition for at least 100 years. Okay, like through the New Deal, like going back to the old sort of technocratic element of Republican progressivism, like sort of moderately progressive, and progressive here just means socially liberal in a kind of way, like I want to be nice, I don't want to go crazy, I'm not looking for socialism, but I believe in taking and having some support for people, right, like this kind of thing. They were a key element of the Republican Party through Reagan and Bush, and I think they started to shift under Bill Clinton. And it was a little bit mixed, but then now today they don't like Trump, and they're really strongly shifting away from Trump. Not all of them, make no mistake, not all of them, right? These are just tendencies and generalities. But college-educated voters are starting to turn on or turn towards Democrats, right? So I don't know. Those are important shifts, right? Where it's like the lower class is going one way and the upper class is going another way, which makes me feel a little bit bad about class because I think we should all get along. But that's neither here nor there. So I don't know what to say about that. And so that's just a really fascinating shift for how things are changing. On the other hand, against the idea that we're really entering a new era, we might just be seeing some like final reshuffling into a more stable era, a more stable party system, and that's also a possibility. So we could at that point still call it a seventh era, maybe, maybe not, or it might just be finishing off the sixth era where our main coalitions were set and we still had a little bit of shuffling of people sort of getting to a little more natural positions for them. I don't know. But most industrialized democracies have a major right-wing party that's a mix of religious actors and interests and big industry, and a left-wing party that's economically progressive and also focuses on ethnicity and civil liberties and some of these other things, right? So it feels to me like it's entirely possible. I don't know if this is the time will tell, right? Like we'll just wait and time will tell what the answers here are going to be. But it's entirely possible that the rough coalitions we have are going to be relatively stable for at least a while, maybe a long while. I don't know for sure. I really have no idea for sure, but it feels like that's a real possibility. Okay. And then just as far as like how does this affect sort of like electoral politics, and some other additions that you can throw in to say maybe there's something happening that's kind of like a seventh era. Um, the upper Midwest, which through my entire lifetime were Democratic strongholds, Michigan, Wisconsin, those places are much, much more swing statey now than they used to be. Okay, Michigan voted for Trump by 10,000 votes, right? Well, the question here is, does Michigan stay a swing state? Does it go back to being a little bit more Democratic leaning? What's going to happen here? On the Democratic side, new ethnic coalitions are joining in. So Latinos are the fastest growing voting bloc in the United States, fastest growing voting bloc in the United States. And they're kind of interesting because there's certain elements of Latino culture that makes them very open to Republican ideas. Lots of business people, for example, kind of cultural conservative tendency coming out of the Catholicism, but they're breaking strongly to Democrats right now for relatively obvious reasons. Trump keeps calling them murderers and rapists and things like that. You just don't feel very welcome if you showed up at somebody's house and it's like, oh, well, you're a murderer and a rapist, you'd be like, okay, I can go now. Like, I don't know what to tell you. I think that's a very reasonable sort of response. But once Republicans can get over that, you might start seeing Latinos and Asians also who have that same kind of mix of business, cultural conservative, some lefty ideas. It's kind of hard to say for sure. Sort of realigned back towards Republicans. And the most interesting and fascinating phenomena that may indeed portend the forthcoming of a more significant shift. And this is a big piece of information that I really think maybe does matter: the rise of decline to state voters and independents. And that tells me that there's a large percentage of the American people who aren't happy with either of these political parties and are looking for something new. Now, I doubt a party is going to go away, but it might mean another strong realignment happens, and one of the parties, they seem to be pretty evenly matched to me right now. Like Obama had all three branches of government for 2 years, Trump had it for 2 years. So it's like it's very, very narrow overall as far as I can tell, in balance of power. And one side just gets an advantage and tries like take as much advantage of it as they can because they know it's not going to last. But maybe there's something that's going to happen and it's going to like break. And the population is going to go one way or another, right? I mean, if you're liberal, you think, Trump's like doing it for us. If you're conservative, you might think Trump's doing it for us too, and an election's coming. This is being recorded in September 2020. So we'll see what happens in the election. I don't think this election is going to be the make or break moment, but you never know. You only know in hindsight, okay? We're only going to see either the Democratic or Republican Party kind of like completely disappear if one of them makes a really dumb choice, akin to the Federalist Party, right? Remember the Federalists, first era, what did they do? They didn't support the war effort enough. You know what I mean? And this was a really serious war effort. Britain was literally invading us. Like, that was a huge mistake. It's different from Democrats in 9/11, or not even 9/11. It's different from Democrats and the war in Iraq. It was like, do we really need to go? I don't know. There's some kind of like pretty reasonable opposition. I'm not trying to say they should have or shouldn't have, supported or not supported. But it was like, you kind of understand the Democrats who didn't want to support, right? Or the Whig Party, stupid mistake. You got to take a side on the one big issue of the time, right? And so, we'll see what that means. Does another outside event come in that kind of reshuffles things? Does Trump make things break one way or another? I think we're in for another 4 to 10 years of kind of trying to sort this out. But I actually probably think, well, I'll just leave it at that. If Trump gets reelected, I think it's more likely that realignment kind of accelerates because he pokes at those social cleavages so strongly, whereas Biden's a little bit more of a unifier. So Trump gets reelected. I mean, he's just going to be really pushing his power, and it makes people take sides, which is good in short-term electoral interest, but it's not always good for the long-term interest of your political party, although maybe he wins and then the Republicans are dominant for a long time. I don't know. I'm just a regular guy over here. Okay, so 121 minutes. I know that's a little bit long, but that's basically a regular class period. So I don't know what to tell you. Watch the video, take your notes. I want to see them.